Christmas is really close, and I do like to bring you cheerful, festive news. Trouble is, I can only work with the materials I have. And UK inflation has accelerated up to 2.6 last month, which means any upbeat hopes for a further cut in interest rates must, I think, now be filed under one day someday. It's not a massive jump up from 2.3% in October, and it's mainly caused by higher prices for clothing and petrol. Trouble is, the economy is already stagnating. GDP, what we produce, has been shrinking for 2 months. Business surveys speak of weaker confidence and fewer people being hired after Rachel Reeves's tax-raising budget. So what are the options now for a government that says it's all about growth? Let's hear from Sir Howard Davies, the former chairman of the NatWest Group, chair of the Royal Bank of Scotland and former director of the London School of Economics. Howard, great to have you on this show. The Bank of England is taking its decision, I think, tomorrow, the Monetary Policy Committee. Is there any doubt now about which way they're going to go, do you think?
I don't think so. They really would surprise people if they chose to move tomorrow after the figures that came out today. So, yeah, I think February is the earliest possibility of getting an interest rate cut, and even that now looks odds against.
So this is a relatively modest rise, and we read why it's happened. But do you think this is the beginning of a further set of rises in inflation? In other words, that long and quite sharp fall from the very high rates, is that now over, do you think?
I think it probably is. The most worrying figures are that core inflation is over 3%. That's stripping out the variables of fuel and food. And then also, particularly in the service sector, you've got inflation of over 5%. And it would seem that wage increases in the service sector continue to run quite high, at about 5%, in fact. And while that is the case, it's quite difficult to see how inflation can fall back down below 2%. We do seem to be more susceptible to continued inflation than other countries. In Europe and the US, have had one or two little blips up. But generally, if you look at the way in which inflation is developing in the Eurozone and in the US, it's going in the right direction across the economy, and ours is not.
Do you have any thoughts about why that might be happening, Howard? What's wrong with
this? Yes, I do. One is that there are surveys which show that inflation aversion, a slightly complicated term, but in other words, the resistance people and businesses have to raising prices is less here than it is in many other countries. And this is from surveys. You can say to people, well, inflation is going up. How much do you care about that? Is that your big concern? And in this country, I'm afraid people say, well, not really. Whereas in Germany, they say it's a big concern for them.
Is this partly poor management? In other words, managers of different kinds taking the easy option of hiking up prices and hoping for the best rather than making cuts or making their business more efficient?
I think to some extent that is true. But what we need to look at is over a long period of time, when we had that long period of very low interest rates, you had inflation in the Eurozone averaging 1% for about a decade. Here, we thought inflation was pretty low, but we still averaged 2% actually over that period. It was still higher. And I think you're right that there are signs that businesses do not bear down on their costs when they could. Now, their excuse is that we have a tight labour market and that if they don't follow prices up, then with wage rises, then they won't be able to recruit people. And that has been true, but I think that's going to become a bit less true because there's also other evidence that says that the number of vacancies in the economy is now beginning to fall and falling relatively rapidly. So I think what the Bank of England will be looking at is over the next 3 to 6 months, do businesses carry on cheerfully giving people 5% across the board wage rises, which is what's going on at the moment? Or are they brave enough to say, no, we're not going to chase this current inflation figure because it's unrealistic to think that we can keep going on like that, and start to moderate their pay offers? We'll see. But at the moment, it
We'll
doesn't
see.
look too promising.
We certainly will. I was mentioning also we've had now 2 consecutive months, just months, not quarters, of GDP falling back. Are we in danger of having to dust off one of the uglier words from the 1970s, stagflation?
Yes, I fear we are, because the optimistic scenario was that the Bank of England will be cutting fairly firmly and that would offset the impact of the budget and the increase in national insurance and all that. But if the Bank of England does not cut for a while because of this persistent inflation in the service sector, then you can have an unpleasant combination, which is tax rises and also increase it, no reductions in interest rates. And you've got quite a high pound. Because our interest rates are remaining higher than elsewhere, the pound is strong. We're now at 121 against the euro, where not long ago we were at 115. That puts an additional squeeze on exporters, etc. So I do think that at the moment it's not great. And then one last factor to mention is that today we've seen the gilt market react such that our long-term borrowing costs, the government's long-term borrowing costs, are at their highest in relation to Germany, which is the European benchmark and has been for a long time, higher in relation to Germany than they have been for about 30 years. So that also shows that there's going to be pressure on the government's debt interest line. So I fear that things are not looking great. I don't say that with any enthusiasm, but they're not.
Yeah. So we've mentioned stagflation. All this leads me to ask you whether you think in the first half of the year ahead there's the danger of the other big word, recession.
Well, there is, yes. Although, I don't attach a fantastically high degree of importance to that, because recession is a technical term, which means 2 quarters of negative growth. But, we had one earlier in the year and nobody really noticed it terribly much. I mean, as long as the economy is sort of bouncing along roughly on zero, I think whether it's technically a recession or not doesn't make a lot of difference. But I think the prospect is for a flatlining economy over the next 12 months, which is not great news.
Well, we've done, in a rather bleak midwinter way, the economics. Let me turn to the politics, Howard. Do you think this is, as it were, a final and decisive thumbs down on the budget, looking at all the surveys of business and all the numbers that are beginning to come out?
Well, it's not great news for the Chancellor. I'm not trying to hide from that. But I think to root it all back to the budget is somewhat misleading, really. It's not the budget that is creating service sector inflation. And so the budget can be blamed for one or two things, but I think most of them were inevitable. In other words, having to raise taxes given the budgetary position. And if they hadn't done that, then I think our interest rates and the gilt market would be even worse than it is. So I think some elements of the budget were appropriate. What was bad about the budget, in my view, is that it was a budget that followed commitments in the election campaign not to do the obvious thing, which is to increase a bit of income tax and increase on national insurance on individuals. That would have been a better way to do it, but they ruled all that out in the election campaign.
Absolutely right. And I think they're still scuppered by those commitments made unwisely at the time. So Howard Davies, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. It's been really illuminating.